Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ Dhammaṃ Sanghaṃ Namasami. When I first received the life and teaching of Ajahn Chah at the end of the 100-year celebration at Wat Nong Papong, a book which some of you may know we have been waiting for 20 years. I was very happy to receive a copy, and so taking it back to Germany, I made a determination to read it cover to cover whenever I have the opportunity to make that kind of time. And the obvious time seemed to be the Vasa period, the rains retreat period. But just as it turned out, Ajahn Metiko, one of the monks I'm living with in Germany, in our monastery there, he started translating the autobiography of Luang Pu La, who is another one of the great masters from the Thai forest tradition. And he kept passing me these manuscripts, snippets of bits that he translated, and I got so inspired and wrapped up in that, and I kind of felt, well, I don't want to really share Luang Por Chah with Luang Pu La or vice versa, so I never really started to read Luang Por Chah's biography, because like I said, I wanted to read it in one go. And I'm a very slow reader, so I knew I needed a lot of time. So at the end of the Vasa, after the Katina, a couple of days later, I left for Thailand, and I knew I was going to have a whole month in two of my favorite monasteries in Thailand. The first 2 weeks I spent in Taodam with Ajahn Siripanyo, and the second 2 weeks before coming here I was with Luang Por Tui in the northeast. And I finished the first half in Taodam and the second half at Luang Por Tui's. And I must say, what a beautiful, wonderful, amazing experience that was. I mean, I couldn't have asked for a better place to read this beautiful life and teaching of Luang Por Chah than sitting on a mountaintop in a bamboo hut with a grass roof, overlooking nothing but jungle, and listening to the sound of gibbons and hornbills and other creatures of the wild. So I felt very privileged. So I had nothing to do but read Luang Por Chah's biography and meditate. And the same was the case in Luang Por Tui's monastery. And one of the beautiful experiences, or why it was such a beautiful experience for me, was because it brought everything back for me. You know, it's like, you know, memory is a tricky thing. You go and live in another country. I had been living in Australia for 13 years after I lived in Thailand for 7 years, and the last 10 years I've been in Germany. And even though every year I came back to Thailand for a couple of months to spend time with teachers and friends, still you tend to, there's a sense of distance and memory just kind of being impermanent. It kind of fades, memories fade. At least some, or probably all of them fade in the end. And so, because for me, when Ajahn Chah, the way he structured this book was he started with the end. And for me, the end was the beginning. And because everything that he described in the first chapter was around the time of the cremation. And it was a time I remembered very well. And you know how memory works, is sometimes you think you've forgotten something, and then there is a smell, or there is a sound, or maybe a taste even, or something that makes contact with our senses, and a memory that you think was completely gone is all of a sudden right back there. And that's how it was for me. It was almost like a reliving of that time, and it all bringing back the beautiful time that I did spend in Thailand. So I carried this book with me. I actually had to carry it in a plastic bag because, I don't know, it's probably a bit of an attachment of mine, but I was given a bowl bag which fits just my bowl that the monks usually carried in Thailand when they went in their tudong. And I was given that as a novice, and I still have it to this day. For some reason, the impermanence hasn't manifested. I don't know, I just tend to like wearing things until they fall apart, but for some reason these bowl bags, maybe they weren't made out of better material or something. Anyway, but that means my luggage is usually restricted to a shoulder bag and my bowl bag. And I'm not that frugal, so I do tend to fill it usually to the brim. And so the 800 pages of Luang Cha's biography just wouldn't fit. So I actually went on the plane with my shoulder bag, my bowl bag, and a plastic bag with the with biography. But it was worth it. So it went from Thailand to Germany, from Germany back to Thailand, then to Singapore, back to Thailand, now to Malaysia, and back to Thailand, and then back to Germany, unless I give it away somewhere. So, yeah, this thing about memory, memory and perception, as you know, they're very closely related. And also they're very closely related to mindfulness. And the Buddha said one of the descriptions of mindfulness is one who remembers what has been said and done a long time ago. But still, sometimes you think you've forgotten things, and it's usually through the practice or through the reminding yourself of wholesomeness or the reminding yourself of the Dhamma and putting energy and effort into the practice, that things will come back to us. Sometimes things from a long time ago, and sometimes maybe even things from past lives. It's just the way memory works. I was always impressed by the idea that the Lord Buddha could remember 91 eons. You all know what an eon is, right? It's the time from one big bang to one big crunch or whatever. It's like something like 36,000 million years. And the Buddha could remember 91 of these in detail. So where does it all go? Is it stored somewhere? How do we get access to it? Which means it's there, nothing really gets lost. It's just the way that we develop our mind that through coarse ways of acting, a coarse livelihood, or the neglecting of precepts, that the mind becomes more dull, it becomes more blunt, it becomes more coarse, and things disappear. And then once we get ourselves, as it were, back together, sometimes we do a meditation retreat, or we put more effort into our practice, and these things come back to us. And it's something we should remember. It's the importance of maintaining kusala, wholesome mind states. That is the most important part of Dhamma practice, right effort, which is probably mentioned more often than many other qualities, is something that's got to do with developing and maintaining wholesome mind states, and of course abandoning unwholesome mind states. So every time we make the right effort, every time we turn to something beautiful, we practice, whether it's loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, which, by the way, is one of the qualities that I always tend to develop on an occasion like this. Being here, it gives me a tremendous joy. I sympathize with so many people coming together, doing good things together. Much was said by some of the other monks about the training in Wat Papong being all about community life, doing things together, coming together as human beings interested in spiritual practice, and then resolving to do something good together. It brings up a good energy, and that energy is tangible. And if you focus on that, if you allow your mind to dwell on that, then you can develop this one of these three Brahma Viharas, sympathetic joy. You can feel it, and it's a beautiful thing. One of the teachings of Luang Por Chah that has always intrigued me was something he said about the present moment. There's a lot being said about the present moment, and we all know we should develop mindfulness in the present moment. One of the things that intrigued me when I first came across it was where Luang Por Chah said, if you understand the present, you understand the past. If you see the present, you see the future. In fact, he said that the past, the present, and the future, they are one. I found that really intriguing, because a lot of times we hear, well, you know, the past is gone, the future hasn't arrived, just dwell in the present moment. So when I came across this teaching of Luang Por Chah, where he said, well, if you really see the present, you understand the past. If you really understand the present, you also understand the future. These three are connected. The present moment is the link between the past and the future. And I played with that in my mind a lot, and I came across a few other teachings by other great teachers also about that. And one was interesting as Luang Por Wan. He's also one of the great warriors from the forest tradition. He said, the past is dumb. The future is dumb. The present is Dhamma. So I thought, is he talking about the opposite, or is he talking about something different? Then I came across another teacher, Luang Por La, just when Ajahn Metiko was starting to translate his autobiography, which, by the way, is really beautiful Dhamma. He said, how did he put it? He said, if we have not yet seen the mass of suffering in the past, the present, and the future with regard to the 5 groups of existence, then we need to bring these times onto the same level. He said, we cannot say that the past has no value, and we cannot say that the future has no value. So the idea then to bring the past, the present, and the future onto the same level, it rings again with what Luang Por Chah said about that the present, when you understand it, reveals understanding about the past and the future. So then I kind of looked at the suttas a bit more, and what did the Buddha actually say? I wanted to know what the Buddha actually said about these things. And there's the one quite well-known teaching where the Buddha said, well, wrongly reflecting is when we kind of think about the past in terms of, was I in the past? Was I not in the past? Who was I in the past? What was I in the past? How was I in the past? Will I be in the future? What will I be in the future? How will I be in the future? Or else he is confused about the present. Am I not? Who am I? What am I? Where do I come from? Where do I go? And of course, you realize it's about the sense of self that we develop with regard to the past, the present, and the future. So, what the Buddha said is that if we think about the past and say, oh, in the past I had, this kind of body and these kinds of feelings and these kinds of thoughts and perceptions and consciousness, and then I delight in that, then the Buddha said that's wrong. If I think about the future, maybe I will have this kind of form, this kind of body, this kind of feeling, these kinds of perceptions, these kinds of thoughts, this kind of consciousness, and I delight in it, and the Buddha said that's wrong. And if I do it about the present, if I delight about the idea of body, feeling, perception, thought, consciousness, if I delight in these things in terms of, this is me, this is mine, this is myself, then the Buddha said that's wrong. So apparently, we can even be in the present and get it wrong. So being in the present moment doesn't necessarily mean we get it right. And taking up the past or even the future doesn't necessarily need to be wrong. The problem is with delighting in it. Because if we delight in samsara, if we delight in these 5 groups of existence that make up our entire being, our entire experience, if we keep delighting in it, if we keep seeking delight, then that delight invariably will increase our craving for existence. It will increase our craving to be, to have, to experience. And we all know that that's the cause of suffering. So we're not actually looking at our experience, as was said many times today, in terms of just mindfully observing, knowing, understanding these processes that we experience 24 hours a day. There's a body 24 hours a day. There is feeling all the time. There are perceptions, memories, thoughts, consciousness all the time. And if we just blindly follow our delight with regard to these things, whether it's in terms of the past, or the present, or the future, then the Buddha said, we increase craving, and craving leads to suffering. So what the Buddha was saying in another beautiful sutta was where he said, what we should really be paying attention to, instead of delighting in these things, is the fact that there are characteristics that we can observe with regard to these experiences that we have, which reveal the impermanence, which reveal the fact that these things are conditions, that these things are compounded, made up, that they're not solid, not stable, they can't be really justly viewed as a self. And these are things that point out or point to the fact that there is an arising, there is a change while these things are present in us, and then they cease. So sometimes when we look for impermanence, we don't really find it. But when we look for the characteristics or the things that are always there, if we look at the body, sometimes physical manifestations, they arise. Certain skin disease maybe. I had a rash under my armpits when I was in Daudam. It arose because I was stupid. I had 3 showers in Bangkok because it was so hot. And the person whose house I stayed in, he had this shower gel which had these little granular pieces in it, almost like sand. So I was rubbing myself with sandpaper. And I thought it was a rash, but I had actually scrubbed off a layer of my skin under my armpits. So I could see this physical condition, it arose and it changed. I could watch it change. And I was actually quite relieved when I realized the cause of it, because it wasn't a rash. It wasn't some weird disease. It was just a mechanical error. And then it disappeared again, and now it's gone. We have feelings. Feelings arise. You have feelings in the area below your heart. Sometimes you're going into an audience. You have to give a Dhamma talk, or you have to give a speech or a lecture. You see somebody important. There's this feeling of heat manifesting in your solar plexus region. You can see it arising. You can see it changing, and then it disappears. Perceptions, memories, they arise, like I said, out of the blue. Seemingly, I remembered things when I read the biography of Luang Por Chah that I thought I had completely forgotten. And then, the memory kind of unfolded, it changed. And then the memory stopped. So what the Buddha is saying then is that if we pay attention to these characteristics of the fact that all our experience in terms of these 5, what we call the 5 aggregates, they have an arising, they change while they are there, and then they cease. And if we can manage to pay attention to that, whether it's thoughts, ideas, feelings, perceptions, then what that does, it really reveals the fact that these things are sankharas, they're conditions. They're things that are, conditions. It's the best word. They call it formations sometimes. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's something that arises because of conditions. Sometimes someone asked the Buddha once, they said, what are sankharas? He said, if you use the word condition as a translation, he said, they are called sankharas, or they're called conditions, because they condition the conditioned. And when I first read that, I thought, sounds complicated. But what it does, it points to the fact that a condition is not just a conditioned phenomena, something that just is, but it's something that it arises. And it also conditions other things. So the Buddha is pointing to the fact that it's both conditioned as well as a condition for something else. And if we pay attention to that, the Thai forest tradition, they talk a lot about these sankharas. And in fact, it was the Buddha's last words, wasn't it? For those of you who remember the Buddha's last words, Vaya Dhamma Sankhara Pamadena Sampadeta. All conditions are impermanent. Strive on with heedfulness. So paying attention to sankharas, but paying attention to them in terms of these factors that determine why they are sankharas, or that make them sankharas, that make them conditions. Which is the fact that things arise. They don't just arise and cease. They arise and then they're there for a while and they change. And we can watch that, we can see that, we can perceive that, we can know that. And that will point us to the fact that these things are impermanent. And then, what the Buddha said, it leads to this delight that we usually have to actually fade away. The delighting which leads to craving. I mean, what is delight anyway? What is craving? Delight, someone once said, is the active form of craving. In the Second Noble Truth, the Buddha says, we find delight here and there. We find delight here and there. We seek delight because we want to be delighted. We want to be entertained. We want to be thrilled. We want to get a kick out of things. That's what we want, isn't it? We're used to getting a kick out of things. And that's why when we come to meditate from a busy life, we usually go to sleep quite easily because the mind is no longer stimulated. Yeah? So this seeking of delight in the past, the present, or the future, that's what the Buddha said is leading to craving, perpetuating suffering. This craving is, what it wants to fill the gap, as it were, between this hope or this illusion of a self that we have, and the fact that we basically have nothing to show for it. It tries to justify our existence, but we don't have anything to show for. Because everywhere we point at the body. It's impermanent. It changes. I'm 53 years old. I kind of look at my hands sometimes and I squeeze the skin. I say, this is 53, this is 63, this is 70. It changes. You can see that. It's all changing. And so craving, it wants to fill this gap. We want to delight in things. We're distracting ourselves, thinking about the past, having entertaining thoughts of how wonderful it was. Remember the good old days, when we used to be young. I did this picture book for the monastery, and I had to look at all these pictures, a sort of a walk down memory lane of 10 years of Muttodaya. And even in these 10 years, there's so much change has taken place. So, if we look at the past in terms of finding delight in it, or look into the future and seek delight, what will I be in the future? How exciting! And then we won't understand. But of course, as the famous Lumpur Someto saying is, now is the knowing. Insight happens now. The realization or the understanding or the insight is something that can only ever happen in the present. It can't happen in the past because it's gone. Future is not there yet. Yeah? But if we see these arising factors, if we see the fact that these things change while they are there, if we see them cease, if we actually mindfully stay with anything until it ceases, yay! It's like a victory because you see it. Yeah? And then you see, these arising factors, They're the same in the past. This present moment is a product of the past. Yesterday, today was tomorrow. Today, yesterday is the past. But they're connected. And the connectedness lies in the fact that they're all sankharas, they're all conditions. There is no fixed me or mine in any of these conditions. And so looking for these things is not easy. I mean, nobody says it's easy. But we all love a challenge, don't we? So try it out. It's good fun too. If you have time to meditate and you have mindfulness or even some samadhi for change, and you can actually see these things, how they arise, how they change while they're there, and how they cease, then that's a victory, because that shows you the nature of sankhara. It really makes you see impermanence directly in the present moment as an understanding. And then the mind does something very beautiful. It turns away from these things. These things fade away. Like Ajahn Guniko was saying, they just disappear. We watch them. We watch them with mindfulness, but without feeding them, and they disappear. And the mind goes quiet, the mind goes peaceful. And that's beautiful. When I arrived in Thailand yesterday, we heard Ajahn Kalyano talk about his time where he was with Luang Por Chah already at a time when he was sick. And for me it was the same thing. Reading the biography, it brought it all back. How I was fortunate to be around at a time where Luang Por Chah was still alive, even though he wasn't actively teaching. We had this beautiful opportunity every observance day, on the half moon days and the full and new moon days, we would go over to Wat Papong, because one of the great teachers, Luang Por Phut, he said that if we were to do some chanting for Luang Por Chah, chant his favorite paritas, it would actually help him extend his life. And so Ajahn Pasano, he took us over every once a week on the observance days, and we do some of Luang Por Chah's favorite parita chantings. And depending on how the condition of Luang Por's body at the time was, they'd bring him out in a wheelchair, and we got to see him and pay respects and do the chanting. And that in itself, to me, was always, I don't know how many times I paid respects to Luang Por Chah with this wholesome mind state of, love and devotion that I had just developed through previously reading his teachings. I kind of had a feeling that there was a connection there. It was Luang Por Chah's teachings that made me decide to stay. I was only, just like many of the other monks, going to be there for, as Ajahn Tira said, a month. I had half a year that I gave myself. I made a determination, go to Wat Pananachat for half a year, come what may, and then get enlightened and go back to Germany. So after half a year, of course that hadn't happened yet, so I decided to stay. Wrote a letter, say to my parents, I'm not coming back, I'm going to be a monk. In those days, Buddhism wasn't really on the map for my parents. But strangely enough, and this relates to memory and perception again, as soon as I had written a letter to my parents saying, I'm not coming back, I'm going to be a monk, there was Thailand on the television, there was Thailand in the newspapers, there was Thailand in the magazines, people were talking about Thailand here and there. Didn't Thailand exist before I decided to become a monk? I don't think so. But that's how perception works, isn't it? You don't think or perceive in a particular way, then certain things just don't come into consciousness. But then something gets triggered, and all of a sudden it's everywhere. So then my parents got on the first plane to rescue me from this weird cult. And, well, they were treated like royalty. I think anybody who has ever had their parents visit Thai monastery would attest to that. They were chauffeured around like royalty, and they had such a great time. I loved it. And I certainly realized that it wasn't a strange cult, but actually a pretty legitimate religion. So I was allowed to stay. It was actually quite beautiful. I got to ask forgiveness from my parents before I became a novice. Or was it? No. Yeah, before I became a novice. Yeah, so then for me, the only close encounter, as it were, that I really had with Luang Por Chah was during the time, much as Ajahn Kalyana was relating yesterday, when we were nursing him. And I think I was about 3 or 4 years into the monkhood, and I was granted a fortnight shift, a night shift at the hospital kuti. And it was one of the most amazing experiences I ever had, because the conditions were absolutely perfect. It was a good time of the year. It wasn't too hot, it wasn't too cold. The other 3 monks with whom I did the night shift were excellent monks, incredibly attentive, mindful. We spent much of our time at night sitting next to Luang Por's bed, meditating. And the presence of this powerful being was certainly there. Meditation did take on a different form when you were sitting in the room where Luang Por Chah was lying, especially in the quiet of the night. And so I learned a lot about nursing Luang Por Chah. One of the things that Luang Por Liam had stipulated for all the monks who wanted to nurse Luang Por Chah, if they wanted to do, because remember Ajahn Kalyana was saying yesterday that he was still feeding him with a spoon. By the time I got there, which was in 88, probably would have been around 1990, he was already completely paralyzed and we were feeding him through a nasal tube. So to put the nasal tube through Luang Por's nose into the stomach and then to inject the food into his stomach, it's quite a tricky thing because you have to push the rubber hose until the glands in the back of the throat and then wait for the person you give it to swallow, because only then the glands will open and then you can push the rubber tube down into the stomach. If you push it and he doesn't swallow, it gets very uncomfortable, it uses vomiting, and it's very, very unpleasant. So one of the rules was anybody who wanted to do that to Luang Por Chah would have to do it on themselves. So I remember staying at Wat Papong, and one night I had one of these CNGs and I had it in my kuti, and I stuck it into my nose and I was like, oh, oh. So I can't remember, this is again memory loss, how many hours, but it was a few before I finally managed to actually do it to myself. So I was very happy, so I went to say I did it, and so I got permission. So when I was on this first night shift with these monks, and like I said, everything went incredibly well, and I was so inspired and so happy that I went to Luang Por Liam to ask for an extension. I wanted to do another 2 weeks. So one morning I went to Luang Por Liam, and he was just talking to some people, and I sat away from him maybe a couple of meters. He was talking to people, so I thought, okay, I'll wait. And he just completely ignored me. So it's like I wasn't even there. So I was just like looking around, you know. And the one group left. And then a second group came, still didn't even look at me. So I was looking around, talking to these people, completely ignored me. And then they left, and then monks came, and he talked to them. And it went on for almost an hour, and he completely ignored me. By that time, I had enough mindfulness to know that I was getting angry. Or somewhat annoyed. And I was getting angry for being angry. So it was a very hot and unpleasant and self-conscious and just really unpleasant mind state. But it was getting worse because there was another group coming and Luang Por still didn't even acknowledge me. So finally they had left, and then his attendant monk came, and this was literally after more than 45 minutes, almost 1 hour. And this attendant monk brought some warm milk and some coffee, freshly brewed, and some honey. So Luang Por Liam was there, stirring his café au lait very slowly, very mindfully. And by that time, I was pretty hot. And then Luang Por Liam took his cup and he leaned off his seat and he put this hot steaming cup of sweet milky coffee right in front of my nose, looked up at me and smiled. So I didn't get this teaching from Luang Por Chah, but I'm sure it's something that Luang Por Chah would have done also. But Luang Por Liam obviously is Luang Por Chah's student. So it's the most beautiful teaching. No words necessary. Just taking me from hell right up into heaven. Just with one smile and a cup of coffee. So, with regard to requesting another fortnight, Lumpur Liam didn't say anything, which was as good as a yes, I figured. And so indeed I did get to do a second shift. And, well, as impermanence goes, it was not a night shift, it was a day shift. And unfortunately, the monks on this shift weren't so attentive, weren't so keen on preserving a meditative atmosphere. In fact, they were quite chatty. And also they didn't seem to have much experience. So I was really the only one, even though I had only done one shift. I was the only one who knew how to give the nasal tube to Lumpur. I was the only one who could operate the oxygen, do the medicine. And so I was seemingly doing everything while they were doing very little, except chatting a lot. So there was this time, and we were exercising Lumpur, and I was at the foot end because I was actually the junior monk on the shift. I was at the foot end, and then the other monks were massaging the arms. I was massaging the feet. The other monk was massaging the head, and we were doing exercises to keep Lumpur's muscles from degenerating. So, but during this exercise, one of the monks' duties was to make sure that Lumpur wouldn't urinate into the bed, because he was paralyzed, remember, and he had no control over his bodily functions. And so there was this special receptacle that the monk would have to hold so that Lumpur wouldn't urinate into the bed. And he was responsible for that. So as we were exercising, then the monks kept chatting and laughing and talking. And again, I never perceived myself as an angry person, but I got pretty annoyed because I felt, this kind of typical sort of young monk, self-righteous. Why can't they be more respectful? This is the great master. And sure enough, Lumpur urinated into the bed. So, okay, well, that meant turning Lumpur over, redoing all the bedding, takes about 10-15 minutes. And again, the monk was supposed to be holding the receptacle in case Lumpur had to urinate, chatting, talking, laughing. The second time, Lumpur urinated into the bed. I was almost blowing a fuse, but I knew that in Thai society to show anger like that is very, very bad. So I really contained it. So okay, we did the bed a second time, and so this monk again had the job to make sure the receptacle stayed in place. And you wouldn't believe it, Tatiyampi. For the third time, Lumpur urinated into the bed, and I couldn't hold my anger. I blasted this monk, who was actually senior to me. I really yelled at him for being, disrespectful and unmindful and whatever. And then Lumpur, from a lying posture, sat up by himself, straight up. And I was at the foot end, and he looked into my eyes. And I was just even telling the story, my hair stand up, It was unbelievable because it wasn't supposed to happen. Luang Por was supposed to be paralyzed. And so I'll never forget that look. It was like he was piercing my heart, And so again, it was a teaching without any words necessary, because the message was loud and clear. Luang Por was pointing out the fact that whatever anyone else does or says, you have to take responsibility for your own mind. You have to look after your own mind. You have to keep your mind wholesome, no matter what other people do or say, even to me. So even if they treat me in a way that you perceive as improper, you cannot be angry. So it was, like I said, my only close encounter with Luang Por Chah, but certainly one that has bared or borne, whatever the word is, on my mind ever since. And over the years, as the meditation developed and I recollected this particular incident again and again, different facets, different ways of seeing it came up, because this is again one of the beauties of Luang Por Chah's teachings. Even when you read some of the teachings I read when I first came to Wat Pananachat were wonderful, and then I read them again a year or so later, and they were wonderful, but on a completely different level. So these things, they kind of change. And again, in light of what I said before, in terms of looking at these arising factors, a fact that things change and then cease, is something I can observe with regard to that as well. My sense of self, my creating an identity around my views and perceptions about how things should be, how these have changed over time. And then using that as a way to see just the fundamental impermanent nature of all these sankhara, until the mind really dwells on it with, applied and sustained application, until the mind sees it and then lets go and turns away from delighting in these things. There's nothing to delight in. We should question that. And to most of you probably it sounds a bit harsh, because much of lay life is about finding delight. But then again, we wouldn't be here if we weren't honestly and seriously interested in the Dhamma of the Buddha, which at the heart has the Four Noble Truths. And so there is suffering, and we do experience it from time to time. And as we keep delighting in samsara, delighting in these five aggregates, delighting in conditions, then we will perpetuate it. And so finding ways to lessen the delight so that the mind can become more peaceful, is something that we can all do, because it's a natural process. It's Dhamma, it's nature. If we pay attention to these things, they will grow. If we pay attention to coarse things, then the coarse things grow. We pay attention to refined things, and these refined things can grow. So we have a choice. We have the ability to change for the better. So I don't know, how long have I been going? It's about an hour or so. Huh? Good enough? All right. Ewang.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.